right, let's jump right in. Today we're taking on a pretty dense book.
Yeah.
It's called Name of Book by Conrad Riker.
Yeah, I know this.
It covers a ton of ground. History, technology, psychology.
It's a lot.
But for this deep dive, we're going to zero in on the evolution of warfare and specifically how it connects to
I
masculinity.
think that's something a lot of your listeners are really interested in. For
Yeah,
sure.
exactly.
Uh,
And what's so fascinating about Riker's approach is he doesn't just lay out battles and dates, like a textbook.
yeah, he really gets into the motivations and the ambitions. Like,
Yeah.
what's driving all this? The underlying forces that shape how wars are fought.
And then in turn, how all that fighting shapes us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's a real feedback loop there.
Okay, so let's start with one of the most attention-grabbing parts of the book, Nazi Germany's wonder weapons.
Oh, yeah.
V-2 rockets, jet fighter. This stuff sounds like it's straight out of science fiction.
It was pretty mind-blowing for the time.
For
And I
sure.
think that's part of Riker's point. These weapons weren't just about military advantage. They were symbols.
Power.
Yeah, power, technological dominance. And Riker argues that this drive to create the most advanced weaponry.
To just push the boundaries of what's even possible.
Right. It was deeply connected to a certain idea of masculinity, one that emphasized ambition and this relentless pursuit of power.
Okay, so even back then, technology was already wrapped up in these ideas of masculinity and power.
Oh, absolutely. It's fascinating to think about how that same drive might play out today, even in areas that seem totally unrelated to the military.
Absolutely. And, it's not just the weapons themselves. Riker also gets into the lives of the people behind them.
The scientists and engineers.
Yeah, can you imagine the pressure those guys were under?
Oh, it must have been incredible.
The ethical dilemmas they faced.
Yeah, take Werner von Braun, for example.
The rocket guy.
Right. He was the brains behind the V2 program.
And then he ended up working on the U.S. space program.
Exactly. But his past with the Nazis that always stuck with him, developing weapons of mass destruction, it haunted him.
Riker uses von Braun's story to ask some tough questions.
About the cost of progress, the moral compromises that come with ambition and innovation. I mean, how far is too far?
Right. And that moral compromise, that's something Riker calls moral injury.
Which is distinct from PTSD.
Right, it's not just about the trauma of war.
Yeah.
It's about the guilt and shame that come from doing things that go against your own morals, even when you're just following orders.
It's a heavy concept.
It really is.
And what's crucial to understand about moral injury is how isolating it can be.
Because you can't really talk about it.
Right. Traditional masculinity often makes it hard for men to express vulnerability or to seek help for emotional distress.
So these soldiers, they're carrying this weight,
Of their action.
but they suffer in silence because they have to maintain this image of strength.
It's tragic.
It is. And it makes you think about the ripple effects. It's not just the individual, it's families and society as a whole.
That's a key point. Riker argues that the impact of moral injury, it spreads outward. It affects relationships, families, even entire communities.
He's saying it takes a toll on everyone.
Right. He suggests that understanding and addressing moral injury is crucial for healing, both personally and as a society.
And that leads us to another really interesting layer in the book, propaganda.
Uh,
I mean, everyone knows the Nazis were masters of propaganda.
They were incredibly effective.
But Riker goes deeper. He explains how their propaganda specifically targeted and shaped ideas about masculinity.
This is where it gets really interesting. Nazi propaganda didn't just glorify war.
Right.
It directly linked military prowess and nationalistic fervor to being a man.
So basically, to be a real man, you had to be a strong, aggressive warrior fighting for the right.
Right. And of course, those wonder weapons fed right into that narrative.
They were like these ultimate symbols of masculine power and national superiority.
It's disturbing how effective it was.
And Riker makes the point that this kind of manipulation, it wasn't just a Nazi thing.
Oh, no.
This is something we need to be aware of in any society, especially when you're looking at power structures and social norms.
Exactly. Riker's encouraging us to think critically about the messages we're bombarded with, the stories we're told about what it means to be a man.
Because those stories, they have a huge impact.
They really do. He argues that understanding how these narratives have been shaped, especially in the context of war, it can help us challenge and redefine them for the better.
So we can create a healthier definition of masculinity,
Exactly. One that's more in line with our values.
one that doesn't rely on aggression and dominance.
Right. It's about finding a better way forward for everyone.
And this idea of challenging narratives, it really comes up again in a section that I found super interesting. The role of women in warfare.
Yeah.
When we think about World War II, it's easy to picture this very male-dominated conflict.
Right. It's all about the soldiers on the front line.
Exactly. But Riker paints a totally different picture,
He shows us how much we tend to overlook women's contribution.
both on and off the battlefield.
Absolutely. While Nazi propaganda was pushing this ideal of the domestic nurturing woman, The reality was women were essential to the war effort.
They were working in factories making munitions.
No.
They served as nurses on the front lines.
They kept the home front running in so many ways.
And it wasn't just in Germany. Riker gives examples from all over the world. Like, did you know there was an all-female Soviet bomber regiment?
The Night Witches?
Yeah. These women flew thousands of bombing missions, often in incredibly dangerous conditions.
And yet, their stories are rarely told.
Right? It's like their contributions were just erased.
It's a powerful reminder that history is often written from a very particular perspective.
And that perspective often leaves out or minimizes the roles of women.
Exactly. Riker's work challenges us to dig deeper, to look for those untold stories, and to reconsider the narratives that shape our understanding of the past.
To question what we think we know.
Right, because there's always more to the story.
Absolutely.
True.
And speaking of untold stories, I was really struck by Riker's discussion of the psychological impact of war.
Not just on soldiers.
Right, on civilians too.
Yeah.
This is something we don't talk about enough, but it's so important.
It really is. One of the biggest things Riker emphasizes is that the trauma of war, it doesn't just end when the fighting stops.
Leave scars.
Deep scars. He talks about the long-term effects of what he calls moral injury.
That guilt and shame that soldiers carry with them.
Long after they've left the battlefield.
And it's not just the individual soldier who's affected.
Right. This moral injury, it can have ripple effects on families and relationships for generations.
It's like this invisible wound that so many people carry.
And as we talked about earlier, traditional ideas about masculinity can make it even harder for men to deal with this.
To seek help or even just talk about their experiences.
Exactly. There's this pressure to be strong, to suppress emotions, to man up.
Which just creates a barrier to healing.
Right. Riker argues that we need to challenge these outdated notions of masculinity.
To make space for men to be vulnerable and seek support.
Because that's true strength.
And that brings us to what I think is the most thought-provoking part of the book. Riker's exploration of the future of warfare.
How warfare is changing.
Yeah, I mean, if World War II was all about tanks and bombs, what does war even look like now?
It's a whole new landscape. Riker argues that we've entered a new era of warfare, one that's defined by technology and remote engagement.
Drones, cyber attacks, artificial intelligence.
These are the tools of modern conflict, and this shift raises a whole new set of ethical and psychological challenges.
And it's almost like war has become disconnected from the human cost.
In a way, yes. When you're fighting a war from a computer screen thousands of miles away, it's easier to forget that there are real people on the other end of those drones and missiles.
That's a scary thought.
It is that detachment, that distance from the consequences of violence. It's something that worries Riker a lot. He argues that it can lead to a dehumanization of the enemy.
And a blurring of the lines between combatant and civilian.
Right, which makes it easier to justify actions that would be unthinkable in a traditional war setting.
So how do we even begin to grapple with all of this?
Riker doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but he does suggest that we need to rethink our understanding of what it means to be a man in the 21st century.
What does true strength look like in this new world?
Exactly. He argues that it's not just about physical prowess or aggression.
So what is it about?
It's about adaptability, emotional intelligence, ethical decision-making, being able to navigate a complex and rapidly changing world,
To face challenges head on.
to make choices that are aligned with your values.
Okay, we've covered so much here. Nazi wonder weapon, the changing face of warfare. It's a lot to take in. But I keep thinking about this idea of using history as a guide. Like, what's the main takeaway for our listeners today? Why should they care about all of this?
That's what I love about Riker's book. He connects these historical events to the challenges men face today. It's not just about the past. It's about understanding our present and even our future.
It's like he's saying, hey, if you want to understand the pressures you're dealing with right now, the expectations that are on you as a man, you need to understand where all that comes from.
Exactly. By looking at the evolution of warfare and how it's intertwined with masculinity, Riker gives us this framework for understanding how these narratives about manhood, how they've been shaped and reinforced over centuries.
And once you understand those
You
narratives,
can start to question them, challenge them, and ultimately rewrite them.
it's about taking control of your own story, not just accepting the roles and expectations that society throws at you.
Exactly. And for me, one of the biggest takeaways from Riker's work is that true strength, it doesn't come from conforming to those outdated stereotypes.
Where does it come from?
It comes from embracing vulnerability, seeking connection, making choices that are truly aligned with your values.
It's about recognizing that the world is constantly changing, and our definition of masculinity needs to change right along with it.
Absolutely. And I think Riker leaves us with a really powerful question. How can we use the lessons of the past to create a better future? One where technology serves humanity instead of fueling more conflict, where masculinity is defined not by dominance and aggression, but by empathy, compassion, a commitment to actually building a better world for everyone.
It's a big question, but it's one worth thinking about.
It really is.
So this deep dive has given our listeners a lot to unpack. I mean, Where can they go to learn more?
Well, first off, I highly recommend checking out Name of Book by Conrad Reicher. It's available on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
And it's not an easy read.
No, it's dense. It's challenging.
So worth it.
Absolutely. It's one of those books that stays with you long after you've finished it.
I think it's especially relevant for anyone who's trying to understand the forces that shape our lives, our relationships,
Yeah.
our world.
Couldn't agree more.
So to our listeners out there, we encourage you to dive into Name a Book, explore the idea, wrestle with the questions, see what insights you can uncover for yourself, and most importantly, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
Because ultimately, the future is ours to create.
Yes.
And by understanding the past, we can empower ourselves to build a future that's more just, more equitable, and more fulfilling for everyone.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll catch you next time.